So welcome everyone to this seminar today, which is part, of course, of the Proteus seminar series. We have today our speaker, Pablo Montosa, from the University of Barcelona. He originally was aiming at presenting something related to Bruno's natural philosophy and to revisit, so to speak, that theory of the minima. He slightly changed this topic that is in a way pretty relevant for our project. His contribution is called Upsetting World Upside Down, Bruno's Transvaluation of Aristotelian Infinity. So thank you very much, Pablo, for being here today, and I leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia Bianchi, and all the members of Proteus groups. And it is a pleasure to participate in this seminar series, and I am delighted to do so. So, the title of my talk is Upsetting a World Upside Down, Bruno's Transvaluation of Aristotelian Infinity. And I hope that by the end of my talk, this word, this concept transvaluation will be apparent. But now perhaps it's a little bit mysterious. So I'll start without further ado. You could see the slides, or you could see the slides I'm sharing.
Yes, yeah? Yes.
Yeah.
And okay, so between 1584 and 1585, during his stay in London, Bruno published 6 dialogues in Italian, in which he expounded the bulk of his philosophy in a unitary fashion. Scholars unanimously agree that these 6 installments can be divided thematically into 2 distinct parts. The first 3 present the new cosmology and its ontological and theological principles, while the last 3 deal with the moral, political, and ethical consequences that flow from the former. Thus, the third dialogue on the infinite is the bridge, we could say, where the passage from the cosmological to the moral sphere takes place. The dialogue presents itself as an open refutation of the Aristotelian finite cosmos. In it, Bruno argues that Aristotle's main error lies in his rejection of the infinity of the universe. However, if we pay attention to the causes that Bruno deems to motivate such rejection, we will see that these ultimately coincide with the cognitive biases that lead to the assumption of moral universalism. So, my thesis, the thesis of my talk, I don't know if you see it. Right, well, I don't know.
Yes, Pablo, if you keep the format as it stands, we can see it. Thanks.
Okay. So in this talk, I aim to prove that, contrary to the established belief, Bruno's critique of morality is not a consequence of his cosmological view, but rather that his cosmological view derives from his critique of moral universalism. Towards the end of the third of the 5 dialogues that comprise on the infinite, Burkio, the character who acts as a spokesman of the Aristotelians, replies to Fracastoro that whoever defends the theory of the elements he has just expounded will be turning the world upside down. Burkio says, in this way, you will put the world upside down. Fracastoro's reply is, will you consider him to the ill who will upset a world which was upside down? In this passage context, the target of subversion is the Aristotelian theory of the natural places of the elements. In fact, as Philothea, Bruno's spokesman in the dialogue, previously pointed out, this subversion is the consequence of an early subversion, the subversion of the Aristotelian conception of infinity, which Aristotle himself explicitly presents in Physics 3:6 as a subversion of its traditional conception. In a critical moment of the second dialogue on the infinite, one of the characters, Alpino, paraphrases a passage from Aristotle's De Caelo regarding the ancient philosophers who proclaim the existence of an infinite whole. Says Alpino, however small an error may be in origin, it becomes by 10,000 repetitions ever greater, just as the smallest error of direction in the beginning of a path becomes greater and greater the farther the distance we traverse. As a reply, Philotheo throws the accusation Aristotle hurled against his predecessors back at him. Philotheo says, for even as he believed that from a wrong understanding of this original point, his adversaries have been led to great errors, so we, on the contrary, believe and see clearly that by the opposite opinion concerning this prime matter, he has perverted all natural reason. As this passage points out, according to Bruno, Aristotle's main error is the denial of the infinity of the universe. This might suggest that the core of Bruno's polemic with Aristotle lies in a conceptual disagreement. However, if we pay attention to the causes that allegedly have led Aristotle to deny the existence of infinity, we will realize that under this disagreement, there is more than meets the eye. According to Bruno, Aristotle's first mistake lies in turning his perceptual limitations into an attribute of the universe. Says Philotheo, it is asserted against all reason that the universe must terminate exactly at the limit of our perceptive power. But as Bruno will explicitly denounce, this error depends on the even more fundamental one of taking the relative immobility and centrality observed from our terrestrial horizon as essential attributes or properties of the Earth, thereby erecting a center of absolute rest, which can only have a place in a finite cosmos. And says Philotheo, once the end of the thread is found, the tangle is easily unraveled, for the difficulty proceeds from the method and from an unfitting hypothesis, namely the weight and immobility of the Earth. So, as Philotheo says, the error comes from the method and an unfitting hypothesis. The unfitting hypothesis is the assumption of the centrality and immobility of the Earth. The method or way of proceeding, because Bruno's original Italian simply says model. This method or way of proceeding is to turn a relationship into an attribute or invariable property of one of the relative. In the first case, Aristotle projects his perceptual limitations onto the cosmos, which becomes finite. In the second case, Aristotle turns the stability of his viewpoint regarding the motion of the stars into a property of the Earth, which becomes motionless. By doing this, Bruno shows that every polyadic predicate which expresses a relationship is reduced by Aristotle to a single monadic one, becoming a property. No? So we could say the relationship between perceiver and the thing perceived and his perceptual limitations become a property of the Earth, the finitude of the Earth. And the relation of relative motion and rest regarding the stability of the Earth becomes an attribute of the Earth, the mobility of the Earth. And I say, now Aristotle's method is precisely the method Plato used in his battle against the sophist. Thus, when Protagoras argues that honey is sweet to the healthy man and bitter to the sick, indeed Theaetetus, Plato removes the relational clause that associates honey sweetness with the individual who tastes it and converts it into an attribute of honey and consequently into a monadic predicate. According to Plato, Protagoras' error lies in limiting himself to the world of the senses, composed of a plurality of particular, relative, and changeable things. But in this world, where things are always changing, coming to be, but never achieving true being, true knowledge cannot be found. It can a world where the sweetness of honey is independent of the palates that taste it. Well, as is well known, Aristotle coins the concept of substance to partially introduce in the world of the senses some of the properties that Plato reserved solely for the intelligible brain. The Aristotelian substance is, in the first place, that which designates the essence of things. The essence are defined per genus et differentiam, a specific that essentially belongs to the thing. Thus, for example, a human being is essentially a rational animal, rationality being the universal property that distinguishes it from the rest. Secondly, this universal substance subsists through change and is conceived by itself, independently from any accidental modification that the sensible substance composed of matter and form may undergo. Instead, these changes are only explainable by that which remains, as the substance permanence is taken as a brute fact. The changes in the substance refer to its accidental properties, but also its unique properties, or propria. Accordingly, if we consider sweetness to be a unique property or proprium of honey, it will be sweet, regardless of who tastes it, and it cannot cease to be sweet without ceasing to be honey, as Aristotle says in the categories. Thus, honey, because it possesses sweetness, is called sweet. It's not called sweet because it has been affected somehow. So once we remove the other relative, namely the individual who perceives the honey, to affirm that honey is sweet and bitter is equivalent to attributing to it two mutually exclusive predicates, thereby falling into a blatant contradiction in such a way, from an Aristotelian point of view, Protagoras' world, that is, the world as it appears immediately to our senses, has been reduced to mere accidentality. Perceptions are not intrinsic relations, but the result of fortuitous encounters between substances, detached from their essential nature. Protagoras could have used to refute Aristotle's objections, since all his works, which were numerous, are lost. However, nothing prevents us from reconstructing his thought from Plato's account. As we have already said, these statements, honey is sweet to the healthy man and honey is bitter to the sick, imply dyadic predicates. That is because honey's sweetness and bitterness result from perception, and each perception expresses a relation between the thing perceived and the thing that perceives it. From this viewpoint, the statement honey is sweet seems incomplete and meaningless. For it to be a complete statement, it should specify for whom honey is sweet, because honey in itself is neither sweet nor bitter. Therefore, we can claim that Protagoras does not contradict himself when he states that honey is sweet to the healthy man and bitter to the sick. He will fall in contradiction if he asserted that honey is sweet and bitter to the healthy man, which he does not. We could even argue in Protagoras' favor that by making sweetness an attribute of honey, Plato is taking the conditional, if upon tasting honey I perceive its sweetness, then honey is sweet, a conditional which expresses a relationship, since honey is sweet only insofar as I perceive its sweetness, for the conditional, if honey is sweet, then upon tasting honey I perceive its sweetness, thereby incurring in the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Protagoras' exposure of this illicit reasoning on the part of his opponent is apparent in this passage from the Platonic dialogue named after him. So in the Protagoras, say Protagoras, You are not correctly recalling what I said in answer to your question, Socrates. You asked me if the courageous are daring, and I agreed that they are. But you didn't ask me, in addition, if the daring are courageous. For if you had asked me that, I should have said that not all are. Well, you may wonder what Protagoras has to do with Bruno. The point is that, just as Aristotle, with his concept of finite substance, has provided an ontological basis for lodging Plato's forms in the world of the senses, so Bruno, by asserting the existence of a single substance, of which the things of the world are nothing but its accidents or modes, has provided an ontological basis for Protagoras' relationships. So as you could see in this table, I don't know if you are seeing this table, but the contrast. Okay, the contrast between the two is striking. No, we have two opposite worldviews, Aristotle's and Bruno. No, there's a mistake here. There are not. It's Aristotle's finite substance, Bruno's infinite substance. So for Aristotle, God is an unmoved mover, detached from the world, finite, a finite immaterial substance. And things of the world are finite material substances. On the contrary, for Bruno, there's only one infinite substance, which is God. God is immanent cause of the world, so it's not detached at all, because it's not substantially different from the world, and it's a unique infinite substance, the only substance. So things of the world are modes or intrinsic relations of this only substance. So, since there is, according to Bruno, only one substance, and the things of the world are nothing but accidents of it, these accidents must necessarily be regarded as essential accidents, an expression no doubt Aristotle will find oxymoronic. That is why Bruno prefers to call these accidents modes. And I quote Bruno, "For every mode therein, in the substance, is a thing, and everything and every mode and they are the same, the one as the other." In Bruno's understanding, things as modes are the reverse of substance. They are in something else by means of which they are conceived. And these in two senses. They are in the substance they inhere and comprehended by it, but they are also in another mode and comprehended by it. Since God, that is the infinite substance, is the immanent cause of things, these things must be conceived by his immanent activity and not as his external products. Things, as well as the worlds that form these things in the infinite universe, are gestures of the divine face, as Bruno says. They all move and live, grow and render effective several acts of their vicissitudes, produce, nourish, and maintain their inhabitants and animals, and by certain dispositions and orders, they minister to high nature, changing the face of a single being through countless subjects. So, to understand what Bruno means, we should think of things as the gestures that, for instance, a gymnast makes when exercising. Properties, in any case, supervene these things, as for instance, a specific physical complexion supervenes the one who exercises. Now, if things are modes, and modes are always in something else in virtue of which they are conceived, then, in Bruno's view, things are intrinsically relations, but not relations which take place in between things, but which essentially constitute them. Just as, for example, we can say that husband and wife do not exist as such before the relation marriage. Jeffrey E. Brower identifies two opposing theses on the reality of relations in history of philosophy: the realist and the anti-realist. The first, the realist, will hold that things are related independently of any activity of the mind. The second, on the other hand, the anti-realist, is that there are no polyadic properties or accidents in extramental reality. However, both will share the same premise. Relations are that in virtue of which things are related. Instead, the Brunian concept of mode implies a much more radical realism of relations, according to which relations are that in virtue of which things are. So, how are these constitutive relations reduced to properties? We have already seen this by removing one of the relata. The wife becomes a widow when the husband dies, and their former relationship becomes an invariable property of her. So then, to go deeper into the method of reduction of polyadic predicates to monadic ones, we must inquire into the nature of this suppression, and in particular, of negation understood as deprivation. Most linguists and philosophers who have dealt with the subject of negation have remarked that negation cannot be considered a monadic predicate, since being built on a prior affirmation, it depends on the thing previously affirmed and in relation to which it is predicated. This principle is accepted by Aristotle himself, because in his metaphysics he says, the affirmative proposition is prior to and better known than the negative, since affirmation explains the denial, just as being is prior to not being. So it's a widely accepted principle. When we say that honey is not sweet, we are carrying out a reasoning that involves at least two terms. On the one hand, the idea of sweetness associated with honey, and on the other hand, the idea of another flavor associated with honey, such as, for instance, bitterness, which in turn we do not associate with sweetness. As a result, non-sweetness cannot be a property of honey. So if this was to be the case, so would all the infinite lacks or absences that we could predicate of honey, such as, for instance, non-triangularity, non-drivability. That implies that negative sentences and predicates must be counted among the class of ellipses or anaphora when they do not specify the other term of the relation they presuppose and to which they refer. In this sense, the statement honey is not sweet only makes sense in a discursive context that presupposes the bitterness of honey. Otherwise, the uterance refers to an empty referent, which the receiver can fill with any other flavor that diverges from sweetness, such as salty or sour. In reply to such an argument, Aristotle will point out a commonsensical observation. We do not talk about a sweet triangle, a bachelor baby, or a blind stone. Accordingly, we do not attribute sweetness to a triangle, bachelorhood to a baby, or blindness to a stone. Instead, we do so to one of marriageable age or naturally capable of sight. As a result of this reasoning, sweetness, although not perceived, can continue to constitute an essential attribute of honey in the privative form of non-sweetness. In this case, deprivation falls on the perceiving subject whose illness prevents him from accessing the real taste of honey. But it can also fall on the perceived object, as in the case of the blind man deprived of sight. And that's the concept of privation by Aristotle. No? She says, we say that that which is capable of some particular faculty or possession has suffered privation when the faculty or possession in question is in no way present in that in which and at the time in which it should be naturally present. So that's Aristotle's move to reduce negation, which is a relation, into a property, an essential property of things, in the guise of privation or deprivation. And I think if we try to dissect the thought process or algorithm underlying the concept of privation, we will see that it can be explained as the result of implementing the following steps. The first step, affirmation. We affirm vision as a connatural attribute of a human being. Step 2, negation. We deny vision in a particular human being. Step 3, privation. We affirm the previous denial as an attribute of that human being in a privative form, namely blindness. In fact, it is the same mental algorithm by which the perception of the bitterness of honey is reduced by Aristotle to the privation of its sweetness. Step 1, the connatural sweetness of honey is affirmed. Step 2, the bitterness of honey is denied insofar as it differs from its essential sweetness. Step 3, the non-sweetness of honey is affirmed as a privation of its connatural sweetness due to the illness of the one who perceives it. If, however, we maintain with Bruno that all properties are relational, the criterion that allow us to distinguish between a relative or accidental negation and a privative or essential one will vanish into the thin air. For Bruno, privation is nothing. At most, it is nothing but a being of reason resulting from habit. We assume that honey is sweet, that an adult must be married, or that a particular animal species can see. As a result, when we find an exemplar that disappoints our initial expectations, we project those expectations onto it in the form of faults. But in doing so, we are reifying a lack, a mere negation, and conferring being to non-being. However, things cannot be defined by what they are not, but by what they are. Hence, what distinguishes a blind person is not his lack of vision, but the peculiar relationships he establishes with his environment and the strategies he employs to adapt to it. And indeed, the same thing will happen with an individual who is far above average age and who has to cope with a medium that is not tailor-made to his or her size. So, according to these principles, we must necessarily conclude that from Bruno's perspective, each step of the deprivation algorithm will entail engaging in illicit reasoning. In the first step, we move from the proposition, if when tasting honey I experience sweetness, then honey is sweet, according to which honey is sweet insofar as I perceive it is perceived by someone as such, to the proposition, if honey is sweet, then when tasting it, I experience sweetness, which explains sweetness by a connatural attribute of honey. And Bruno will not accept this. So the first step is a misstep. In the second step, we move from the proposition, if honey is bitter, then honey is not sweet, according to which honey is not sweet only insofar as it is perceived as bitter, to the proposition, if honey is not sweet, then it is bitter, which allows us to define bitterness as non-sweetness, and which, to that extent, is equivalent to affirming that honey is bitter if and only if it is not sweet, which is blatantly false, since it could well be neither sweet nor bitter, but sour or salty, without the affirmation of any of these tastes implying the negation of the others. So the second step will be denied. In the third step, the affirmation of the bitterness immediately perceived by the senses is subordinated to the negation of sweetness and becomes conceived by virtue of what is not, as deprivation of sweetness, subverting the priority of affirmation of a negation and making the former dependent on the latter. So far, we have shown that behind the Aristotelian denial of the existence of the infinite, the following premises lie: the affirmation that every existent thing is necessarily a finite substance, the subsequent reduction of relations to the natural properties of those substances, And finally, the necessity of reintegrating those properties into the substance under the form of privation when we cannot attribute them to a particular substance in a straightforward manner. This analytical toolkit will allow us hereafter to understand clearly and precisely the substantial conception of finitude in Aristotle, as well as its correlative denial of the actual existence of the infinite, and its partial reintegration in the real under a privative and unknowable guise. In taking the finitude of particular substances as an unarguable starting point, Aristotle jumps into the discussion about the nature of infinity by playing with market cards, as we could say. Moreover, he keeps those cards so close to his chest that he does not reveal the premise of his whole argument until the end of the 4 long chapters, chapter 4 to 8, he devotes to the issue in Physics 3, book 3 of the Physics. So, in line 208a13 of the 8th chapter, the last chapter, he plainly states, what is limited is not a relation. In order to clarify this point, Aristotle distinguishes being limited from being in contact. The former is not a relation, whereas the latter is. Since everything that makes contact with something and is an accident of some limited things. The issue is that each body, being a finite sensible substance, is limited by its own figure, without such a limit implying in itself the reference to another body. For every finite substance subsists and is conceivable by itself, making contact with another is something that happens to it or supervenes it. So this is how the finitude of substance results in the substantialization of finitude. Limitation or finiteness acquires all the characteristics proper to substance. Everything that exists by the sheer fact of being is necessarily finite or limited. Accordingly, finitude is complete, independent and conceivable by itself. In other words, finitude is a whole. As Aristotle puts it, whole and complete are either entirely the same or very close in nature. Nothing is complete that has no end, and the end is a limit. Aristotelian finitude in this respect acquires an absolute and positive sense. So one must judge Parmenides, says Aristotle, to have spoken better than Melissus. The latter says the infinite is whole, the former that the whole is finite. As can be seen, by explicitly depriving the limit of its relative sense and making it a feature of particular substances, Aristotle remains faithful to his usual procedure of reducing any dyadic or polyadic predicate to a monadic one. Everything susceptible of being conceived relationally will become a substance attribute defined by its genus and specific difference, and explained by its substantial nature. Movement and rest, up and down, center and periphery, even left and right, become proper and inseparable attributes of certain substances, says Aristotle. Every sensible body is in a place, and the specific differences of place are up and down, before and behind, and right and left. These are not merely relative to us or to position, they are so in the universe itself. If this is so, finitude, understood positively in the Aristotelian way, is one of the specific properties or attributes that substances possess in their own right. In that case, infinitude is only conceivable negatively as a negation of substantial finitude, and that in the twofold sense of negation that we had seen, a relative and accidental one, as well as a privative and proper one. In the first conception, we have negative infinity, which Aristotle associates with two mental processes, addition and reduction or subtraction. The former, addition, is infinite because there is always the possibility of finding a number greater than any number assigned. The latter, subtraction is also infinite because there is always the possibility of reducing a continuous extension to a smaller magnitude than any magnitude assigned. In both cases, the infinity at stake here is conceived negatively and anaphorically. Thus, what we have is always a finite and determinate number of or magnitude. However, by relating this positive quantity to another unknown quantity different from the previous one, which we can add or subtract, we say that such quantity x exceeds the previous one. When we fill this empty box with a specific positive quantity, we have a finite and determinate quantity again. So infinity can only be conceived as a partial negation of the previous finite quantity. That is why Aristotle would characterize this possibility of always exceeding a given quantity in the direction of the large or the small as potential infinity. In such a manner, Aristotle has reduced potential infinity to the purely psychological realm, depriving it of any actual correlate beyond the minds that conceive it. In the second conception, we have privative infinity, which Aristotle does not confine to a mere thought process, but to that which underlies every process in general. Indeed, after rejecting the previous conceptions of infinity as something positive and reducing it to the mere negation of finitude, Aristotle admits that this negation cannot be absolute. If this were so, we could not account for three apparent phenomena: the infinity of time, numerical series, and the infinity of divisibility of extension. However, there is an important feature that Aristotle points out a few paragraphs later. We do not speak about the infinite in extension, movement, or time in a straightforward manner. Movement is infinite because the extension it covers is infinite, and time is so because the movement that occupies it is so. For instance, planets move around the Earth in perfect circles and uniform motion. While they do so, the extension they cover is infinite, as every portion of it differs from the previous one, even though those same portions will be covered repeatedly due to the circularity of motion. On the other side, if we read on to Physics 4, we will see that Aristotle defines time as a kind of number. Time, the definition of time, is a number of movement in respect of the before and after. So we have that in all three cases. For Aristotle, the ontological substratum of infinity is movement. That is why he suggests that infinity exists in the same way that a day exists. We say that the day is infinite because it is never wholly actualized, since when it becomes, it is no longer, it is another day. That being said, we must remember that for Aristotle, the physical correlate of the day is the movement of the sun around the earth. Thus, if we want to inquire about the mode of existence of infinity, we must ask, what is movement? Previously, Aristotle defined movement as, that's the definition, Aristotelian definition of movement, the actualization of what is potentially insofar as it is such. So a block of marble is potentially a sculpture. The marble moves during the process of actualization by which it becomes a sculpture. However, the block of marble potentially does not move, just as the actual marble sculpture does not. Movement, instead, insofar as it is such, cannot be posited either on the potential or on the actual side of things, but in the passage from potentiality to actuality. That is why Aristotle says it seems infinite and is so difficult to grasp. But how could it be otherwise if all that is and is conceivable is a substance, and substance is what remains through change? It is in this precise sense that we must understand the analogies between infinity and matter established by Aristotle throughout these chapters. Prime matter is the ultimate substrate that allows the passage from one form to another during generation and corruption. Its never satisfied desire to acquire a new form makes it possible to account for substantial change. Therefore, and it's Aristotle, it is evident that the infinite is a cause in the way matter is, and its being is a privation. That is why the infinite, insofar as it is such, is unknowable, since the matter has no form. That was indeed, as we have tried to show with our three-step algorithm, the result to which Aristotle was necessarily driven by undertaking the first step and affirming finitude as a substantial attribute, that obliged him to conceive infinitude in the second step as the negation of the previously affirmed finitude, and finally, in the last step, to reintegrate under the form of privation, that is, as the negation of the previous negation, everything that contravenes that substantial finitude postulated in the first place. Let us now finally see how Bruno's criticism of the Aristotelian concept of infinity is easily explainable as a counter-reply to each of the points we have just outlined, and how it entails a subversion of the moral universalism implicit in it. Thus, Bruno starts his attack on Aristotle by redefining finitude according to his own principles. The things of the world are modes, and to that extent, relations. Therefore, finitude is a relation. Rather, finitude expresses a limit, and that limit implies a negation. Now, as we have seen, it is accepted among most philosophers that every negation depends on the prior affirmation of the thing denied, and the affirmed thing, like everything for Bruno, is a relation. We start, thus, from a relation between A and B, that is from AB. Then, in relating A to B, we say that A is finite or limited because it is not that other thing B. That is the only sense in which we can regard something as finite for Bruno. To support his claim, Bruno makes a very witty and ingenious move. Since, according to this conception of finitude, the limit is not something given beforehand, but something produced. It must be understood as the result of a process of delimitation, and the Greek word that Aristotle uses in Physics 3 to designate the action of delimiting is the verb horizein, which is the etymological root of the word horizon. This etymology allows Bruno to use the image of the horizon to illustrate his relational conception of limit. When we look at the horizon line, we have the impression that this line actually exists and that it divides, limits, or separates the sea or the land from the sky. In fact, as Bruno says, the arc of the horizon that our deluded vision imagines over the earth is merely a distortion of perspective. Neither the sea limits the sky, nor the sky the sea. Likewise, finitude supervenes things by putting them in a relation and considering that one partially negates the other, but it in no way constitutes a substantial attribute. Moreover, since the impression of finitude depends on these relations between things, which can change at any moment, the limit is something like the horizon line that will always be changeable, and says Bruno. And in this matter, our sense perception advertises and confesses his own feebleness and inadequacy by the impression it gives us of a finite horizon, an impression, moreover, which is ever changing. Thus, in Bruno's view, there is not a single horizon, as Aristotle thinks, that of the sphere of the fixed stars, that constitutes the ultimate limit of the cosmos. This Bruno calls, ironically, the highest horizon. Rather, there will be an infinite plurality of horizons, as many as relationships can be established between the things of the world. And says Bruno, you will then see that however numerous were the horizons around a world, they will belong not to one world, but will have each one the same relation to his own center. So we come to step 2 now. After converting negative and relative finitude into a substantial attribute of things, Aristotle's next step, as we have seen, consisted in denying the possibility of attributing infinitude to them, establishing to that extent a dichotomy between finitude and infinitude, which reduced the latter to a negation of the former. Accordingly, the same procedure applies to all relational predicates. Thus, things will either be naturally at rest or in motion. They will naturally tend toward the center or periphery, and so on. However, once we have stripped things of their substantial quality, as Bruno has done, and have returned these predicates to their original relative meaning, they will cease to be mutually exclusive, and we will be able to hold that the same body is at rest and in motion, depending on the other body we take as a point of reference. Right? Says Bruno, we cannot apprehend motion except by a certain comparison and relation with some fixed body. So likewise, since the center has ceased to be an absolute property of the finite cosmos, there will be as many centers and peripheries as there are points of reference in infinite space. Says Bruno, for the points they suppose to be on the ultimate circumference of the world, whose center is our earth, may be conceived as points of innumerable other earths beyond that imagined circumference, Aristotle's imagined circumference. And we finish, no? We arrive at the consequence that follows from the previous steps, the privative conception of infinity. So, having reduced the infinite to a mental process, Aristotle cannot account for, as we have seen, certain natural phenomena, such as the passing of the days, whose ultimate ontological substratum lies in motion. Now, for Bruno, movement is not a problem. On the contrary, if the things of the world are affections or modes of a single substance, they are essentially changeable. Motion is not something that happens to things. Things are motions, modes, gestures. If nothing happens, in fact, nothing is. Therefore, it is not what is changeable that needs to be explained in virtue of what is permanent, but permanence in change, which can only be understood as the relative motion, more or less stable and regular, that some changing things attain. Far from being unknowable, motion is the most knowable thing that presents itself immediately to the senses. Hence, Bruno refutes the privative conception of the infinite advocated by Aristotle, and of matter as the subject of substantial change associated with it, simply by asserting that privation is not. Privation, at most, is nothing more than a being of reason, which Aristotle has endowed with an ontological entity by reifying negation. So you might conceive of the infinite, and matter, as Bruno says, by privation and logically, he says abstractly, to regard it as something distinct in our mind, but not in nature. And here's my conclusion. As can be seen, the first misstep, step 1, will pave the way for the remaining 2. This step involves reducing relations to invariable properties of finite substance, or, as we have said above, polyadic predicates to monadic ones. Thus, when Aristotle turns the relative rest of the earth regarding the observable motion of the stars into an invariable property of the earth, he reproduces the same gesture or the same bias as one who goes from honey tastes sweet to honey is sweet. In doing so, as Bruno cruelly suggests, Aristotle indulged himself in what he considered the major impediment to attaining actual knowledge, the force of custom. For Aristotle is falling in the same bias that impels us to say that some guy is nice and not that we are fond of him, or that ice cream is great and not that we enjoy it. Since all the qualities that we predicate of things necessarily refer to our point of view, for the sake of simplicity, we remove ourselves from the equation and turn those dyadic predicates into monadic ones, which designate invariable attributes of things. So, in explaining Aristotelian finitude as the sophisticated product of a bias introduced by custom, Bruno pays Aristotle back in his own coin. For if Aristotle confined relative infinitude to the merely psychological realm, Bruno relegates absolute finitude to the domain of error. But this small mistake, which we make every day without even noticing, namely of reducing relations to attributes of things, reproduces the exact mechanism by which we go from if we like something, then it is good, to if something is good, then we like it, which allows us to that extent to erect a universal morality. In effect, to establish an absolute good and evil and not simple qualities in relation to what we desire or reject at a given time, goodness and badness must become invariable properties of things, which explain why they are desirable or contemptible. In this sense, as I have tried to show in this talk, Bruno's criticism of Aristotelian infinitude must ultimately be understood as a criticism of morality. And I will end with two quotes of Spinoza and Nietzsche, who explains the title of my talk and outlines the continuity of Bruno's approach in the history of philosophy. So in a famous passage in the appendix to the first book of the Ethics, Spinoza argues that the doctrine of final causes turns nature completely upside down. For what is really a cause, it considers as an effect, and conversely. Likewise, in a mysterious aphorism from Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche makes the following remark: "No error is more dangerous than that of confusing the cause with the effect. I call it a genuine destruction of reason. Nevertheless, this error can be found in both the oldest and the newest habits of humanity. We even sanctify it and call it religion and morality." This confusion of cause with effect is a modality, as we have seen, of the so-called fallacy of affirming the consequent, consisting in going from if I like something, then it is good, to if something is good, then I like it. Thus, the goodness we attribute to things insofar as we like them becomes an attribute of things that explains our liking for them. Nietzsche portrayed his philosophical project as a transvaluation of Christian moral values, since he considered these values to subvert the natural order of things. He envisioned their subversion as a transvaluation, that is, as a subversion of the subversion that restore things to their natural sense. Likewise, we could say that by showing the moral assumptions of a scientific theory whose scientific objectivity had remained undisputed for centuries, Bruno carries out a genealogy of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmos, if we could say that. And that's all.
Well, thank you very much, Pablo. This was really an amazing talk. I thank you very much. I'm sure also the other members of the team appreciated the talk. So I kindly ask you to stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
So that we can start with questions or remarks. I don't know whether there are people who want to start first? Okay, Laura Aronjo.
So thank you very much, Pablo. It was brilliant.
Thanks.
So I have just a question. I'm not sure if I got you correctly. And the question raises when you, so when you've done this table, there was Aristotle and Bruno, and then my question regards the role of Protagoras. So you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in Bruno, so relations do not take place between things, but actually constitute them in a more intrinsic way. And if I get you correctly, so you are suggesting that Protagoras would be some kind of ancestor of Bruno's view.
Yes.
Or at least that in Protagoras we could find some seeds of the view that Bruno develops after. So you've quoted a passage from the Protagoras, and I'm fine with that, but I was thinking to another Protagoras view as it's described, for instance, in the Thesis. I'm thinking to this famous passage about the homo mensura sentence or principle and the secret doctrine. So this is Thesis 152 C and following. And there, for instance, so the phenomenon of perception is described, and I think it goes a bit in the direction you were trying to illuminate. And so there we read that the cold, or in the example of the dialogue, is the white. So the so the white, so is not in the eye, is not in the subject, nor in the object, in the white perceived object, but rather is to be placed in an intermediate dimension between the two, so metaxou, says Plato. And so within this perspective, changes seems to be only apparent, or more precisely, so they do not belong to the object and to the subject, but are intrinsic, are not intrinsic, but they are accidental, so to say. And so my question would be how to square this with Bruno, who seems to be exactly on the other pole. I mean, if it doesn't square well, no problem, because this Protagoras view, as it's reconstructed by Plato, is perhaps not historically reliable.
No.
But I just see this kind of tension.
No,
Thank you.
Thanks to you. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what is Protagoras' secret doctrine? I'm not a specialist on this matter, but I was really, which I wanted to point out is that we could read Protagoras from Bruno's perspective in that way. In that sense, perceptions are as relations with relations that constitute for, so to say, the perceiver, the perceiving subject and the perceived object, and are prior to the perceiving subject and perceived object. I think it's interesting, this hypothesis of reconstruction, Protagoras' secret doctrine, because then the doctrine of the flux has, I mean, it's more consistent, no? It's not so Platonic, it's not so accidental, because if things are relations, then movement is an intrinsic property of things. Things are movements. And so this, in certain sense, brings a new angle to the flux doctrine, which was a doctrine that I think that Plato traces back to Heraclitus.
Yeah, it's a mixture between Protagoras.
It's a mixture, yeah.
And Heraclitus.
But think in fire, no? If fire, so to say, is a substance, and it's, for instance, is a paradigm of the only one substance, what are bodies? Are flames? Are no, there are no substances, there are no objects as we usually consider. There are movements. So you can individuate a body as you individuate a flame that is moving in the fire. And I think that's a kind of a way of bringing back these pre-Socratic philosophers and vindicate his natural philosophy, his natural conception, which Bruno in fact does, because Bruno is always going back to the pre-Socratic philosophers.
But does he refer to Protagoras explicitly? So does he mention Protagoras in his text? Bruno, I mean.
No.
No, okay.
No. That was a way,
okay.
a way to explain this problem, no? To trace it back to this battle between Plato and Sophist. But I don't know. It was simply a way of explaining this point, this duality, no, this between Aristotle point of view and Bruno's. But no, I don't think I think he does not mention Protagoras once. I mean, no.
Okay.
I can't recall it. No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there other questions, Victor?
All right, I'm sorry for the camera. So thank you for the interesting talk. I had a little problem. I couldn't really grasp the idea that God in Aristotle is a finite substance. Now, of course, a finite thing can be finite spatially or temporally. And I understand that the primary substance of the categories, the Aristotelian categories, are finite in both senses. But I wonder, how can God be finite in either sense if we consider that God would be a substance of not of the categories kind, but of metaphysics zeta and lambda kind. So yes, that would be it. That would be my question. And and the second question would be just a point of interest. If you can say a few sentences on the concept of space in Bruno. I'm interested in that, but it's not it's just, you know, it's a point of interest. Yeah. Yes, so that would be it. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I think that there is a problem, no, what you point out, in Aristotle, because the mover is one, but in certain sense there are a plurality of unmoved movers, because we can assign to each of the celestial spheres an unmoved mover, which is the metaphysical cause, as final cause of its proper movement. So I say finite only in that sense, in the sense that it can be individuated,
yes,
and it can be distinguished from another unmoved movers. It's only the sense, but I know there's some controversy here, and I mean, it's not, which are finite substances, are material substances. That's I mean, undisputable. But I say that God could be regarded as a finite substance in that sense, in the sense that there are a plurality, and thereby you can individuate different types of unmoved movers, and the unmoved mover, which is the primus inter pares, no, as Aristotle says.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
And the concept of space in Bruno.
Well, I'm specifically interested in the idea. I don't know Bruno a lot, but I'm interested in the idea that space in Bruno can be understood as this iter, as a plenum of a kind. So this is something that intrigues me personally. But it's not necessary. If you can say a few words, it would be fine. If not, I know that it is an immense subject.
No, yeah. Well, I will say something which is related with my talk now, and I think an interesting thing now. Aristotle has one big problem, one big issue in conceiving of substances as finite, because bodies are limited by its surface. But Aristotle thinks in a plenum also. So these surfaces are always in contact with something else.
All right.
But what happens with the cosmos? What happens when the cosmos ends? And Bruno says, so Aristotle has to split the surface of the cosmos and say that the surface of this cosmos is concave but not convex.
Mm-hmm.
So he is pointing out that the concept of Aristotelian finitude for Aristotle is actually a privation, because he has to deprive the cosmos from the convex surface, so to say. And Bruno doesn't have this problem, because for him space is infinite.
Mm-hmm.
It's infinite and is a plenum, and space is also matter. So space is productive, and things are in a space and are, I mean, like and are produced by a space in some sense. No,
I see.
And we were talking about that in Milano in the Proteus conferences. That for Bruno, and for instance, the sea is not it produces the fish. The fish is not separable from the sea. It's like the sea constitutes the fish. So
I see.
everything is integrated
Wow.
in this space, Brownian space, because a space being an immanent, a product of the immanent activity of God, is also productive. No, and I think that's a way to explain that plenum, that plenitude that you were pointing out. But I think I will stop here.
No, thank you very much. This is very illuminating. Yes, thank you.
Thanks to you.
Okay, Bruno.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because it's something hard to make this microphone work. So thank you very much, Pablo. Your talk was brilliant.
Thanks to
I
you.
really enjoyed it, and I'm really, really interested in your research. So I'm not an expert of Bruno, and I know that Hegelians, whenever we go, we tend to see everything as being as Hegelian. But my question has to do with this relational concept of limit and Bruno's critique of finitude. And so, yeah, my question is only that it seems really similar to me, the critique that Bruno addresses to Aristotle's notion of finitude as Hegel's critique of the Kantian limits, in the sense that what Hegel says in the Logic and on other passages is that Kant, in positing the limits of the understanding, what he is doing really is generating a second object, we could say, or trespassing these limits and defining the limits of the understanding by eliminating or priving what is in the other side. So the thing is that Kant is already presupposing what's beyond the limit, so it's not real finitude in this sense. So if I'm understanding Bruno correctly, would this be a possible connection?
Perhaps there is a connection. I really don't know, but what are you saying? You are saying Hegel is applying in a critical way a sort of is putting in Kant or is saying that Kant is applying a sort of deprivation algorithm as the one the thing is that this deprivation algorithm that I elucidate to explain the concept of privation in Aristotle, I think is a very common thing. And I think it's a thing that, a mechanism that philosophers are applying constantly. And it could be used for explaining lots of things, not only of Aristotle, but also of other philosophers. I have this intuition, and I don't know. It's like it's very basic. It's a very basic algorithm, but it works. It works because I think it has to do with this, ultimately with this cognitive bias that I point out. No, this cognitive bias of simplification, that simplification of reality, because it's something natural that we do, and the consequences of this initial simplification, and how this lead to some sort of concept of privation as a reification of negation. So I think that could be the case, because it's something which is, I think, I regard as very general way of procedure of philosophers.
Okay, thank you. Sounds really interesting. Yeah, we can discuss more about it another day.
Thanks to you.
So, Eric?
Hello, thank you, Pablo, for your talk. It was very interesting. I have two questions. I might just put one of them and see where that goes. And if there's time for another question, then I will pose the other question. So the first one, actually, the second is more of a remark, not a question, but still. So the first item is just this. I don't really know that much about the topic, but just if you can say a little bit more about like the conflation maybe of concepts of something being definite and being finite, or being indefinite and being infinite. So it seems to me that in some cases, when Bruno or Aristotle are talking about infinite, they might be saying indefinite, like abeiron, or they might be saying infinite as in a quantity. So just if you can say a little bit more about this, that'd be very nice.
Thanks so much, Eric. Well, I will say that for Brunos, the definition of something is always positive. So it doesn't entail any kind of negation or limitation or delimitation. So the limitation is something that supervenes this thing, and is a different process. It's the process in virtue of which we can call something finite. But being finite has nothing to do with the essence of this thing. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I think that for Bruno, infinity is always positive. There are different kinds of infinities, but there are always positive infinitudes. But perhaps there is also a sense of infinite in Bruno as indefinite, as you were pointing out, in the sense when Bruno talks about the innumerable worlds. And the innumerable worlds, we can understand that these worlds are infinite, actually infinite. There's an actually infinitude and plurality of worlds, but we cannot know this infinity. So I think that Bruno distinguishes between understanding and knowing. And we can understand that things, some kinds of things like the plurality of worlds are actually infinite, but we cannot know this infinity. So we ignore this infinity. And in this sense, we can talk about an indefinite number of worlds. So in this sense, Bruno will be accepting this concept of partial negative infinity of Aristotle. He doesn't reject absolutely that definition of indefinite, Aristotelian conception of indefinite, as you will say, apeiron, unlimited, as a partial negation of finitude. I think that here perhaps, well, I mean, I'm sure of this because Bruno states that in other works, not on the infinite. He accepts this concept of Aristotle, of indefinite, of Aristotelian concept of indefinite, but he establishes that distinction between knowing and understanding. And this indefinite is only a problem of knowing. So we ignore how many worlds there are. We understand they are infinite, an infinite number, but of course we cannot know that infinite, no? And that's a distinction that I think it's relevant, perhaps, in what you're saying. I don't know.
Good, thank you. I will leave the other remark for another time. So thanks.
No, we have time actually. I have a couple of questions, but I don't see any other participant who wants to raise hands. So please go ahead with your questions.
Okay, it's more of a remark, but I was reminded by something that you said to a recent interpretation of Kant's critique by Karen de Boer, in which she said in her recent book Kant's Reform of Metaphysics, in which she claims that despite the fact that Kant himself often affirms the primacy of the categories, despite this, actually the categories are, in a sense, dependent on the schemata, so on their application to sensible conditions. So that the schematism chapter is not like an addendum to categories, but it is actually through them in which categories are founded. So in relation to how they make experience possible. So it just really reminded me of this when you've been talking about this cognitive bias, that we tend to like substantiate things which are essentially relations. I mean, we can argue about this. Maybe Kant is not how Karen de Boer says he is, but it just something that sounded interesting. So that's my remark.
Interesting indeed. Yes. Thanks, Eric.
No, thank you.
So I don't know whether there are other people who want to ask questions. No, so I have some sense. I have several questions, some remarks, so I'll be brief. So the first natural question that comes to my mind regarding Bruno's view of the universe is the following. Okay, assuming that what there is are modes, and that what we really have to explain is not motion, let's say, or change, but it's the permanence of change. The first question is, then when we have different worlds, because this is the point, so we have also different planets, and these are co-moving systems, right? Okay.
Yes.
So first question is, what is a planet for Bruno? So if Bruno has to define a planet, so first of all, I would like to know whether he distinguished a planet from stars, and if yes, in which sense? And second,
He
the other
doesn't
thought-
distinguish between planet and stars.
Yeah, exactly. So I imagine that. So, but then to point it in a very, you know, naive way. So if each mode is co-moving with other modes, right? And everything is changing. First, how can I differentiate, or how can I systematize, if you like? So a systematic knowledge of the universe is impossible.
Yes,
then.
yes. I understand. Yeah.
Or is just that Bruno is looking for a metaphysical ground, then God is the, let's say, the unique substance of slash within the universe. Therefore, the substratum, so to speak, or better, not the substratum, but the grounding for predicating modes lies in God, basically. And so
I think so.
Okay, so this is the idea. And what are
This is the idea. And regarding the planets, well, there's a little bit of controversy here, because Bruno quotes Plato's Timaeus, these sentences, no, where Plato's apropos of planets say, you are dissoluble, no, dissoluble. It could be said in English that solvable. You are solvable, potentially solvable, but you planets would not be dissolved, no, like planets could be this planetary systems in Bruno could be destroyed, could be separated, but by some kind of divine providence, there will not be. And for me, that's a little bit striking, because to think Bruno in terms of providence and in terms of finality, it's a little bit a contradiction with his conception of God, who is not a providential God, but is a God who produces absolutely everything. So I think that a way of seeing this is a little bit anachronical, but more coherent, is to see that planetary systems are formed in a sort of Darwinian natural selection. So God produces absolutely everything, every movement, every combination of things that you could possibly imagine, but there only remain the ones that by some chance or by their own nature acquire some kind of stability. And that enters into a stage, this concept of synodus ex mundi of Bruno, which is like is a way of depict the reticus systems, planetary systems, which are conceived like homostatic compounds, because those planetary systems, or synodus ex mundi, are related in a way that you have a central sun or a star. So in this sense, the stars are not different from suns. Everything is a planetary system. And you have this sun or central star, and what Bruno calls the earths that go around the sun, and they have like an homostatic relation, in virtue of which the sun feeds with his heat those earths, and those earths evaporate because they are essentially water. That's why they are so solid. And with these vapors, feed in their turn the sun. So sun and the earth surrounding the sun acquire some sort of equilibrium and stability. So what we see is the result of a process, and this process is stable, and this stability is which allow us to make or conceive of general laws, as you say it, and some
but for example, in the Timaeus, this equilibrium is set up since the beginning from or by the demiurge. So and so it makes sense to me. But even if I can disagree or have a different morals, let's say, or no morals, but it's coherent.
And in Bruno, there's an ambiguity because these planetary systems could dissolve. I don't know the English word. Sorry.
Yeah. Can dissolve. Can degenerate.
Can degenerate. Can destroy in some sense, not absolutely, but relatively as stable systems. There's an ambiguity. Bruno says, yeah, it could be that, but they probably will not.
Let's say a local degeneration, so it's not that the whole system degenerates. So it's
perhaps there's a degeneration in thousands of years, and
does he have an idea of evolution related to the universe, a sort of a history of the universe?
I mean, there's no there's no beginning and end of the universe in general. That's for sure. I mean, there's no Big Bang. There's no Big Bang.
But I'm not meaning about the whole.
There's a general, a universal stability, a steady. He will be like is more like close to the stationary theory than not. Absolutely not a Big Bang theory or a creationist theory, that's for sure. But I don't know if this stability is always the same. I mean, it could partially, I think, vary. I don't know.
And then very final remark. I don't know whether I may jump in again by recalling your slide 46, in which you put this table. Well, it's not really a table. It's more like a comparison. So something. So we in a sense, what is criticized here is the transformation of or the attribution of a predicate such as sweetness. Because I perceive something sweet to, something like honey in itself. And I mean, this table, this schema really reminded me of the whole discussion that Kant made with regard to distinction between judgments of perception and judgments of experience. So the whole debate regarding synthetic a posteriori and synthetic a priori, because it's evident that the grounding, so to speak, of the judgments of perception lies completely in the empirical dimension, and therefore in the way in which my senses are affected, and so my subjective mode of judging is at stake. On the other hand, in the judgments of experience related, so the synthetic a priori judgment that really produce knowledge are not at all grounded on an empirical feeling or sensation or whatever. So that's really I mean, but many things that you mentioned in your talk really remind me of Kant,
Of
not
it.
because Kant
Okay.
was, you know, a Bruno scholar or something. We cannot even find Bruno quoted in no
No.
part of Kant's corpus. Nor, of course, Bruno is anticipating Kant's team, but I think that they both felt, I mean, they were working on very, very similar problems. And it's what's very intriguing, and I don't know whether you have noticed that not only in Bruno, but also in some other authors, for example, the fact that the cosmological problem, or the way in which we portray the universe, is extremely related, even if apparently is not. No, apparently we just reduce this to physics, or but in reality it's pretty much related to the logic and to the way in which we okay, there are some metaphysical assumptions on, for example, what is substance, what is not, what counts as accidents or not, whether we think of different modes, you know, of substance and so on. And so the way in which we think of the plurality in the unity, for example, or the unity in the plurality, but it's also true that if we have more or less structured cosmology, we also, this is generally accompanied by a certain type of logic that is done. Certain
I miss you for a bit.
It's, I mean, a certain type of cosmology is always related to a certain type of logic, certain type of paradoxes arising from of language as well. It's not just a matter of logic. So I don't know what I mean, what you think, at least from your experience in studying Bruno with regard to this remark.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that adopting Bruno's viewpoint, it's at least suspicious that some physical theories are named after economic terms or concepts, such as inflation, because I think that this should make us think that perhaps these theories are more human than we think. And in this sense, I think that Kant has a similar approach to Bruno in this critical approachment to physics and to natural philosophy. And I don't know what I was because I was very intrigued by the Herschel paper that you showed me past month, and I think that it should be a connection between Herschel and Bruno. Perhaps it's via Huygens, but I want to explore that, and I don't know if this could allow us to establish a similar connection. I don't think so. But there's a book. I don't think I don't know if you have read it, of Yirmiyahu Yovel, which
yes,
you know it. You know the book, and he is very interesting what he says in this book, because he establishes a continuity not between Bruno and Kant, but between Spinoza and Kant. And I think it's very, very, very suggestive, Yirmiyahu Yovel approach to this issue. And I think perhaps the connection should be look for in this approach between Spinoza critical thinking and Kantian critical thinking, more than with Bruno. And
yeah, I absolutely agree.
historically, I don't think if it's feasible. I don't know.
No. I agree with you with respect to the fact that for sure Kant was acquainted with Spinoza more than with Bruno. Probably he never read anything related directly to Bruno. What he
Oh.
knew, of course, was Leibniz doctrines, well, of course, related to the written ones, at least, and,
Yes.
you know, what is reported by
Yeah.
Walls and Baumgarten, but not more in this respect. So there are some resonances, let's say, of Bruno's thoughts in Kant and in reality are mediated. However, and this is not related to the work that you just mentioned, however, the interesting thing is not that much with regard to Kant's system. The analogies that I found, so the critical system, let's say, so it is with regard to the images and to the way in which he portrays his early cosmology, so the 1755 one.
Okay. Yeah,
where he talks about the phoenix of nature, so these planets or stars better, that destroy themselves and regenerate, so that there is this destruction of subsystems who reborn in another form, in another, you know, or the fact that there is no center in the universe. However, there can be found the center of extreme gravity from which, so yeah, okay, but of course Bruno was not discussing possible consequences of Newton's physics, so it's clear that Kant had different instruments or different tools in order to portray in a more technical way, let's say, the universe, but the universal structure. But what's very interesting is that it's as if God is substituted by gravitational force, basically. So the whole universe is governed by what? Gravity. So that's the idea. And gravity is everywhere.
But this thesis, it could be an unique point of maximum concentration of gravitational concentration. This is also shared by this thesis that there could be a point of maximal concentration of gravity, of maximum intensity of gravity. This is shared by Herschel also, or is only a...
No, this is not shared by Herschel. This is Kant, and it's the young Kant. It's the early Kant.
Because Herschel doesn't seem to share this view, no?
No, he shares the idea that there is a structure of the. He shared. I mean, he endorses this important idea of light. So light travels at a finite velocity, and so we can measure, let's say, the distance of stars by measuring, you know, the velocity. So there is this idea that. And if we look back into space, if we look through space, we are looking back into time. So this is Herschel. And Kant takes it from Herschel, the late Kant. But the early Kant, it's a strange mixture of Galileo Galilei. So it's a strange mixture of Newton and Galileo and Huygens. The cancer cosmology is a very strange, that there are also Cartesian aspects, so it's really no, but it's but the interesting thing is that he talks about the fact that there is no center, the fact that there is a multiplicity of planets that extends into the infinity of spaces. It talks about spaces in plural. There's one time more spaces and spaces. So this is no, it's clearly something that he took by reading Fontenelle and by reading. Of course, he took also sort of revision of the monadology. in mind. There are many elements that converge.
Of course, of course.
Um,
But Fontenelle read Bruno. Fontenelle knew Bruno.
yeah, that's what.
for
That's
sure.
why I think
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
all an indirect. It's all an indirect reading of Bruno.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting. Yes. I don't know. I should explore this issue.
Yeah, there's so much to be done.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thanks.
I thank you so much, Pablo. It was really one of the most amazing
No.
talks that we had.
No, thanks to you.
Hosted. Thank you. Take care. And
Thanks, Silvia.
and hope
Thanks
see
to
you in the
everybody.
future. And thanks everyone for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.